The church bells rang heavily that morning, their bronze voices echoing across the hillside like a warning nobody noticed. Mourners sat under black umbrellas, their faces masks of grief, speaking in hushed whispers. Rain tapped against the canvas above, creating a symphony of sorrow that would have been fitting if it had been real. At the front, a shining mahogany casket waited above an open grave, its brass handles catching the scant light filtering through the storm clouds. Fresh roses adorned the polished wood, white ones, my favorites. How thoughtful of them to remember. Inside that casket was supposed to be me. I stood just beyond the tree line, watching my own funeral unfold like a bizarre play. My black dress clung to me in the dampness, my silver hair pinned under a hat that belonged to my mother. What I discovered that day would change everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and how far people will go for money. Sometimes, the people who claim to love you the most are the ones sharpening the knife behind your back. My name is Evelyn Grace Holloway. I'm 71 years old, though I've been told I don't look a day over 60. I'm the matriarch of the Holloway estate, a keeper of secrets, and until recently, the most trusting mother in 3 counties. My husband Charles and I built our fortune with hard work, acres of prime Tennessee land, 3 successful businesses, and a trucking company that still carries our name from here to California. By the time I turned 70, our worth had reached $30 million. Not bad for a girl who started with nothing but determination and a husband who believed in her dreams. You'd think my children would cherish it, protect it, and honor the legacy their father and I built over 40 years. But instead, they planned to bury me alive to steal it all. The betrayal didn't happen suddenly, like a heart attack in the night. It crept in slowly, like poison in sweet tea. It began with whispers in corners, strange glances at Sunday dinner tables, and conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Papers started going missing from my mahogany desk, important documents I'd organized just the way Charles had taught me. Bank statements arrived opened, resealed with clear tape that caught the light wrong. Then came the phone calls, strange inquiries from institutions I had worked with for decades, asking about withdrawals I never made and changes to accounts I never authorized. Mrs. Holloway, the bank manager would say, his voice careful and concerned, "We just want to confirm these large transfers your son requested on your behalf." My son, Matthew, had never handled my finances. Neither had my daughter Sarah. That had always been my responsibility, something I kept close after Charles passed. The real knife twist came from the neighbors. People I had known for years began pulling me aside at the grocery store, their faces a mix of pity and concern that made my stomach drop. "Evelyn, honey," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon, her wrinkled hand resting on my arm as if I might break, "your son says you've been having some difficulties with your memory." My memory? I could recite every business deal, every property line, and every bank balance down to the penny. I remembered everyone who worked for us, their children's birthdays, and their anniversary dates. I could recall events from 50 years ago with sharp clarity. At first, I thought it was harmless gossip. Families argue. Children exaggerate their parents' quirks to feel more important. I had seen it occur in other families, the slow erosion of respect, the gradual infantilization of parents who spent decades making decisions and running lives. But then the doctor came. Dr. Richardson was his name. He was tall and thin, with nervous hands and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He showed up at my door one Tuesday afternoon, clipboard in hand, claiming to be there for a routine wellness check my children had arranged out of concern for my well-being. I should have slammed the door in his face. Instead, I let him in. I offered him sweet tea and watched as he poked and prodded, asking questions that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. He made notes in cramped handwriting, nodding gravely at answers that seemed perfectly clear to me. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, tapping his pen against his clipboard, "have you been experiencing any confusion lately? Difficulty remembering appointments? Problems managing your financial affairs?" The questions felt loaded, like traps disguised as concern. And through it all, he smiled as if he already knew the ending to a story I hadn't realized I was reading. Days later, I got my answer. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner the way Charles loved, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread cooling on the windowsill. The house felt too quiet without his laughter, but I had found peace in the familiar routines. That's when I heard Sarah's voice drifting in from the living room. She was on the phone, and she thought I couldn't hear her from where she sat curled in Charles's old leather chair. But I could. "She's slipping fast," my daughter whispered, using the tone she had in her teenage years when planning something she knew I wouldn't approve of. The doctor confirmed what we suspected. Early-stage dementia, possibly Alzheimer's. If we push the paperwork through now, we can get the power of attorney transferred before anyone questions it. Before she gets worse. The wooden spoon slipped from my hand, clattering against the kitchen tiles. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the doorframe, straining to hear every word. "Matthew's already started the process," Sarah continued. "We just need her to sign a few more documents. She trusts us, she won't even read them properly. And once we have control of the assets." That's when it hit me. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning it. Not with a gun or poison like in the movies. They were going to kill me with paperwork, bury me under a mountain of legal documents that would erase my identity, my autonomy, my very existence as surely as 6 feet of Tennessee clay. The truth crashed down one evening exactly 3 weeks later, thanks to Miss Thelma, my neighbor with a heart of gold and a knack for sensing trouble from 3 counties away. She knocked on my door as the sun set, carrying a covered dish that smelled delightful and wearing an expression as if she had seen something unbelievable. "Evening, honey," she said, placing the dish on my kitchen table with unusual care. "Brought you some peach cobbler. Extra cinnamon, just like you love." But there was something off in her voice. A hesitance, as if she was delivering news she didn't want to share. We chatted about the weather, the new family moving into the Henderson place, Mrs. Miller's hip surgery. All the while, Thelma fidgeted with her purse strap, her eyes darting to mine and then away. Finally, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded newspaper. "Honey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry for your loss." I frowned, setting my coffee cup down with a clink that felt too loud in the sudden silence. "Loss? Thelma, what on earth are you talking about?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she slid the folded newspaper across my kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it to the obituary section. There, printed in black and white like a cosmic joke, was my own name. Evelyn Grace Holloway, beloved mother and community pillar, passed peacefully Tuesday evening surrounded by loving family, except I was standing right there, alive and breathing, feeling like the world had tilted off its axis. My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded so hard I was sure Thelma could hear it across the table. I traced my name with trembling fingers, reading the lies they crafted about my life, my death, my legacy. They hadn't just betrayed me. They'd erased me. "This can't be right," I whispered. But even as the words left my lips, pieces began clicking into place. The strange phone calls. The missing papers. The doctor who had shown up with his clipboard and knowing smile. Thelma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Honey, when I saw this in the paper, I thought maybe there'd been some terrible mistake. But then I remembered seeing that doctor leaving your house and all the talk around town about your condition." She said the last word like it tasted bitter. "What kind of talk?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand I didn't want to know the answer. "People saying you'd been confused lately. Forgetting things. That your children were worried about you living alone and managing your affairs." Thelma's grip on my hand tightened. "But Evelyn, you seem sharp as ever to me. Sharper than most people half your age." The obituary stared back at me, a death certificate for a woman who was very much alive. Suddenly, I grasped the extent of what my children had done. They hadn't just planned to steal my money. They'd aimed to steal my entire existence. I could have stormed into their homes right then, barging through Matthew's front door waving that newspaper like a battle flag, screaming about betrayal and lies until the whole neighborhood heard. I could have called Sarah and demanded explanations that we both knew would only be more lies wrapped in concern and false tears. But here's what I learned from 40 years of building a business with Charles: screaming doesn't protect a legacy. Evidence does. So, I made a choice that surprised even me. I would play the part they expected, the confused old woman. Frail. Quiet. Easy to dismiss. A woman whose words carried no weight because everyone believed she was losing her mind. And behind closed doors, I would build my case like the lawyer I should have been, piece by piece, document by document, until I had enough evidence to bury them deeper than they planned to bury me. My first call was to Mr. Whitfield, the family attorney who'd handled our affairs for 23 years. A man Charles had trusted, who had never given me reason to doubt his integrity. "Harold," I said when he answered his office phone, "I need to see you. Tonight." And Harold. This conversation never happened. There was a pause. Then, "Evelyn, are you all right? I heard about your difficulties." Even he had heard the rumors. People were spreading doubts about my mental state. "That's exactly what we need to discuss," I said. "Can you meet me at your office in an hour? And Harold, bring your detective." Mr. Whitfield had connections throughout the legal system, including a private investigator who focused on financial crimes. If my suspicions were right, we'd need every resource we could gather. The meeting that night changed everything. Harold's office felt different in the darkness, with shadows stretching across familiar furniture like fingers pointing accusations. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Collins, spread documents across the conference table with the precision of a surgeon. What we found sent chills down my spine. There were forged medical documents claiming I was mentally incompetent, signed by the mysterious Dr. Richardson, who had lost his license 3 years ago for falsifying patient records. There were bank transfers totaling nearly $2 million, authorized with signatures that looked like mine but had subtle differences that only an expert could see. There were power of attorney documents that I supposedly signed, giving Matthew complete control over my assets. And the most chilling part: insurance claims. Life insurance policies I didn't even remember taking out, with my children listed as beneficiaries. They had already begun claiming the policies. My children were profiting from a life I was still living. But the evidence didn't stop there. Janet had uncovered a paper trail that revealed systematic planning spanning over a year. Meetings with lawyers I'd never heard of. Consultations with care facilities about placement options for elderly patients with dementia. Even early talks with real estate agents about selling the family properties. They had schemed my entire disappearance, my institutionalization, my death, and the liquidation of everything Charles and I had built. That's when I made my choice. I wouldn't try to stop the funeral. I would attend it. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't stopping the show. It's stealing the final act. They thought they were so clever. Over the next few days, I watched from my kitchen window as florists delivered arrangements to Sarah's house. I saw the funeral director's black sedan parked in Matthew's driveway for hours, no doubt discussing plans for a service they believed would go unchallenged. They ordered the casket, mahogany, just like the one Charles chose for his father. They booked Reverend Morrison, the same man who married us 43 years ago. They sent invitations filled with false sorrow to everyone who'd known me, crafting a story of sudden decline and peaceful passing to explain away any inconvenient questions. I let them. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't stopping the show. It's rewriting the ending. Harold and I worked late into the nights, building a strong case with Janet's help. We documented every forged signature, every fraudulent claim, every lie they told to set their plan in motion. We contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, who were very interested in a case involving identity theft, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse on such a large scale. But we all agreed, let the play unfold. Let them commit to their performance so completely that there would be no possible denial, no claim of misunderstanding or good intentions gone wrong. They wanted a funeral. They'd get one they'd never forget. The plan was simply elegant. I would attend my own funeral, armed with enough evidence to expose everything they'd done. Harold would make sure law enforcement was present, disguised as mourners. Janet would document everything, creating a record that would hold up in any court in the country. And I would deliver the performance of a lifetime. 3 days before the funeral, I made my final preparations. I went to Miller's Salon, the place I'd visited for 25 years, and had Margaret give me the works. Hair, nails, even a facial that took 10 years off my appearance. Special occasion, honey? Margaret asked as she worked. I smiled at my reflection, seeing not the confused, frail woman my children expected, but the steel magnolia Charles had fallen in love with all those years ago. You could say that, I replied. I'm going to a funeral. The day arrived grey and damp, as if the heavens knew what was about to unfold. Storm clouds gathered over Shady Grove Cemetery like witnesses to a reckoning 40 years in the making. The air felt thick with humidity and the promise of rain, perfect weather for a funeral that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. I dressed carefully that morning. The black dress Charles had bought me for our anniversary 5 years ago, tailored perfectly and still elegant enough to demand respect. My mother's pearl earrings, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who never backed down from a fight. Charles's wedding ring on a chain around my neck, close to my heart where his memory gave me strength. From my hiding place behind the old oak tree, I watched them arrive. The mourners came in clusters, neighbors, business associates, church members who'd known me for decades. Their faces showed genuine sorrow, and I felt a pang of guilt for what they were about to witness. My children sat in the front row, playing their roles perfectly. Matthew in his best black suit, the one he wore to his father's funeral, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah draped in dramatic black, her sobs carrying across the cemetery with Oscar-worthy conviction. Behind them sat their spouses and my grandchildren, who'd been told their grandmother slipped away peacefully in the night. The lies had spread so far that even the innocent had fallen into their trap. Reverend Morrison delivered a eulogy that would have brought tears to my eyes if it hadn't been based on such a fundamental deception. He spoke of my charity work, my devotion to family, my strength in hard times. All true, but twisted into a memorial for a woman who was standing 50 yards away, very much alive and growing angrier by the minute. Evelyn Grace Holloway, the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying across the cemetery, was a woman who understood the meaning of family. She built her life around those she loved, sacrificing her own needs for the welfare of her children and grandchildren. The irony felt thick enough to taste. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The casket, my supposed final resting place, was slowly lowered into the ground. The mechanical noise of the lowering device mixed with Sarah's dramatic sobs and the soft murmur of prayers from the gathered crowd. Ropes creaked under the weight of polished mahogany. My eldest son, Matthew, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face that I now knew were either fake or tears of relief that his plan had worked so well. He lifted the ceremonial shovel, its silver surface catching the dim light filtering through the clouds. The first scoop of Tennessee clay hit the casket lid with a sound that echoed across the cemetery. Thunk. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the oak tree, my heels clicking on the gravel path like the steady march of justice. Each step felt like a small earthquake, and I watched as heads began to turn, conversations stopped, and the color drained from my children's faces like water from a broken pitcher. The first gasp came from Mrs. Patterson. Then another from the Miller family. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water, spreading until everyone was staring at the impossible sight of a dead woman walking toward her own grave. "Sorry I'm late," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden, absolute silence. Traffic was terrible. You could have heard a pin drop in that graveyard. 200 people stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what their eyes were seeing. Matthew had turned as pale as the marble headstones surrounding us. The shovel slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the dirt pile beside my grave. Sarah's dramatic sobs turned into a strangled gasp, her hand pressed to her throat as if choking on her own lies. I walked with calm determination to the edge of my own grave, my heels finding sure footing on ground prepared for my body. I rested my gloved hand on the polished casket, empty, of course, but heavy enough to make the lowering ceremony convincing. "If you were all so eager to bury me," I said, looking directly at my children with eyes holding 40 years of collected wisdom and disappointment, "I thought you might want to see what you signed in my name." From my black purse, the same one I carried to Charles's funeral, I pulled out a manila folder thick with evidence. Bank documents, forged signatures, fraudulent medical reports, insurance claims. The paper trail of my children's betrayal, documented thoroughly by a woman who had spent decades managing complex business affairs. The crowd moved closer, whispers beginning to rise like steam from hot pavement. I could hear fragments of conversation. Is that really? How is she? My God, what's happening? I opened the folder and began to read. My voice carried clearly in the still air, each document a nail in the coffin of my children's scheme. Bank transfer authorization, dated 3 weeks ago. Signature, Evelyn G. Holloway. Except I never signed this document. I held up the paper for the crowd to see. Notice the difference in the capital G. My children never learned to forge my handwriting properly. Matthew started to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Mother, we can explain. Oh, I'm sure you can, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Just like you can explain this medical report declaring me mentally incompetent, signed by a doctor whose license was revoked 3 years ago for falsifying patient records. Gasps echoed from the crowd. Mrs. Patterson had her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. The Miller family backed away as if fraud might be contagious. But I wasn't done. Or maybe you'd like to explain these life insurance claims you filed last week, requesting immediate payment for my untimely death. I pulled out the final documents, the ones that proved without a doubt this wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding, but a planned effort to steal everything Charles and I had built. Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. We were trying to protect you, Mother. You've been confused, making poor decisions. The only poor decision I made, I said, stepping closer to her until she had to meet my eyes, was trusting the 2 people I brought into this world to honor the legacy their father and I created. Then, from the back of the crowd, came the voice that would end their act forever. Matthew Holloway, Sarah Holloway Chen, you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and insurance fraud. Sheriff Deputy Williams stepped forward, his uniform stark against the sea of black funeral clothes. Behind him came 2 FBI agents, their badges shining as they moved through the stunned crowd with practiced ease. Matthew stumbled backward, nearly falling into the grave that had been meant for my body. This is crazy. She's confused. She doesn't understand, I said as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. What I understand is that you planned to bury me alive in a nursing home, steal my fortune, and then collect insurance money on a death you made up. I turned to Sarah, who had fallen into her husband's arms in what seemed like authentic shock. What I understand is that the 2 people I loved most valued $30 million more than they valued my life. The crowd started to murmur, voices rising as the full scope of the deceit became clear. I heard my name whispered with a mix of awe and disbelief, as if I had risen from the dead instead of just exposing a lie. As my children were led away in handcuffs, I stood beside my own grave and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. By sundown, my children were in federal custody. The charges would eventually include wire fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and identity theft, which should give them years to reflect on the cost of their greed. The mourners went home with a story that would spread across 3 counties like wildfire. Evelyn Holloway had walked into her own funeral and buried her family's crime instead of her own body. The estate was safe, the legacy secure, and the family name, though stained by my children's actions, would endure because I refused to go quietly into that false night. In the weeks that followed, I learned the full extent of their plan. The nursing home they had chosen, the doctors they had bribed to keep me sedated and compliant. The timeline they created for selling assets, liquidating properties, and dividing the spoils of a life they decided was no longer worth living. They even picked out my headstone. Beloved Mother, the irony was almost too much to bear. But standing in that cemetery, watching the empty casket being pulled back up from the grave that would never hold me, I felt something unexpected: forgiveness. Not for what they did, that was unforgivable. But for the children they once were, before greed poisoned their hearts and twisted their love into something unrecognizable. I brushed the dirt from my gloves and whispered the words that would become my new motto: they tried to bury me alive. But they forgot something important. I'm not the kind of seed that dies in the dark. I'm the kind that grows stronger. The legal battles would take months. The family relationships would never recover. But Charles's legacy, our legacy, would continue. I established a foundation in his name, dedicated to protecting elderly people from the kind of abuse my own children planned. Every year on the anniversary of my fake funeral, I visit that cemetery. Not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was saved. I stand beside the grave that never held my body and remember the day I realized that sometimes, the greatest act of love is refusing to be buried by those who claim to love you most. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. What would you do if the people you trusted most in this world decided you were worth more dead than alive? Would you scream, rage, and demand justice that might never come? Would you retreat into confusion and let them win? Or would you do what I did? Would you wait patiently for them to dig their own graves, document every lie, gather every piece of evidence, and then walk into your own funeral with the power to reveal everything they did? Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't shouting your innocence to an empty room. It's walking into your own funeral alive, with the truth in your hands and justice behind you. They thought they were burying a confused old woman who couldn't fight back. Instead, they discovered they had awakened a steel magnolia who spent 71 years learning exactly how strong she could be. And that made all the difference.